Back in 1950, safety wasn't part of the conversation. There were no seatbelts, no airbags, and no regulations. It took decades and thousands of lives to change that. Today's cars are safer than ever, but it's worth remembering how far we've come and what we lost along the way. Happy viewing!
Number 12.
Resuming civilian production after World War II, the 1945 Mercury 8 was Ford's premium offering, an upscale sibling to the more modest Ford Super Deluxe. Positioned between mass-market Fords and Lincoln's luxury vehicles, the Mercury 8 was a symbol of post-war aspiration, a large, powerful, stylish car that promised speed, prestige, and American engineering excellence. However, behind the chrome detailing and smooth V8 performance lurked serious design flaws that would later become known as major safety liabilities. The Mercury 8 was one of the fastest sedans of its time, powered by a flathead V8 engine that made it popular with returning veterans and young drivers. Its acceleration and cruising capability set it apart from lower-tier models, but this performance often outpaced the car's handling and structural integrity. The suspension and frame were based on pre-war designs that had not been significantly updated, resulting in a platform that was ill-equipped to manage the higher speeds the Mercury was capable of achieving. As such, it became notorious for instability during high-speed cornering and poor control in evasive situations. A particularly dangerous flaw lay in the vehicle's door latching system, which was unreliable under lateral stress. During hard turns or collisions, the doors of the Mercury 8 could suddenly unlatch, flinging open and drastically increasing the risk of passenger ejection. With no seatbelts or safety locks, occupants were completely unrestrained. A sharp turn or side impact could send them through the open door or even partially out of the vehicle while it was still moving. These incidents were not uncommon and contributed to the Mercury's reputation as a car that was elegant in design but dangerously outdated in execution. Another major issue concerned the Mercury 8's fuel tank layout. Like many vehicles of the era, the gas tank was positioned at the rear of the car, directly behind the rear seat, in a vulnerable location. The tank was poorly shielded from rear-end collisions and was made of thin steel. In crashes, even moderate impacts could rupture the tank or its fuel lines, causing leaks or fires. The proximity of the tank to passengers, with only the rear seat and a single sheet of metal as a barrier, created a significant fire hazard, a particularly deadly scenario when combined with the lack of crash-worthy cabin design. Structurally, the Mercury 8 lacked crumple zones or reinforced cabin compartments. The body-on-frame construction, while durable in some respects, did not absorb crash energy effectively. Instead, impact forces were transferred directly into the cabin, increasing the likelihood of severe injuries. The interior was also filled with hard, sharp-edged components, a metal dashboard, rigid steering column, protruding knobs, and an unpadded windshield frame. In frontal impacts, these features often became sources of serious trauma, especially for unbelted passengers. It's important to remember that in 1945, vehicle safety was not yet a regulatory priority. There were no government-mandated crash tests, no standardized restraint systems, and little public awareness about crash survivability. Cars like the Mercury 8 were designed primarily for style and performance, with comfort and speed prioritized over occupant protection. As such, even prestigious vehicles with impressive mechanical specs were riddled with dangers that were invisible to the average buyer.
Number 11.
In post-war America, Cadillac wasn't just a car brand. It was a symbol of wealth, power, and prestige. And the Cadillac Series 61, released in 1950, embodied that image perfectly. Long, heavy, sleek, and covered in chrome, it was a rolling palace designed for comfort and status. But beneath the glamorous facade was a machine with serious safety flaws that could turn even a minor accident into a life-threatening situation. Let's begin with the most obvious issue: weight. The Series 61 was extremely heavy, weighing nearly 4,200 pounds or around 1,900 kilograms. Yet despite its massive size, it was still equipped with basic drum brakes, the kind more suitable for much lighter vehicles. Under stress, these brakes overheated and lost effectiveness, meaning the car had a terribly long stopping distance, especially on wet roads or downhill. Now let's talk about the interior, specifically the dashboard. In 1950, there were no airbags, no seatbelts, and no padded interiors. Instead, the Cadillac Series 61 came with a solid metal dashboard and a rigid steering column. In a frontal collision, the driver's chest or head would slam into cold steel, or worse, be impaled by the steering shaft. There was absolutely no protection for passengers, especially in high-speed impacts. One of the most ironic dangers of this car was the illusion of safety. People believed that bigger meant safer, but in reality, this was a deadly myth. The Cadillac's frame was built strong, but it had no crumple zones. So in a crash, all the impact force was transferred directly to the passengers. Inside impacts, the doors and panels folded like paper, offering virtually no defense. Handling was also a problem. The suspension was tuned for comfort, not control. That made the car feel smooth on straight highways, but in corners or emergency maneuvers, it became unstable. The heavy front end caused understeer, and without power steering, drivers struggled to control it in fast situations. It was luxury without liability protection.
Number 10.
In the early 1950s, America was hungry for speed. The war was over, prosperity was booming, and drivers craved excitement on the open road. That desire was answered by a car that would become a legend, not just for its performance, but for the danger it carried behind the wheel. The Oldsmobile 88, better known as the Rocket 88, was a groundbreaking machine. It introduced the world to the first true high-compression V8 engine in a lightweight body, delivering unprecedented speed for a mass-market car. With its 303 cubic inch Rocket V8 producing 135 horsepower, it could outpace nearly everything else on the road at the time. It became a sensation overnight, dominating NASCAR races and defining what would later become the muscle car era. But the problem wasn't the power, it was everything else. While the Rocket 88 could fly, it couldn't stop or handle safely. The brakes were small, outdated drum systems that overheated quickly and provided little stopping power at speed. The tires were narrow, bias-ply designs, prone to skidding, blowouts, and poor grip on curves or wet roads. The suspension, designed for comfort, made the car lean heavily in turns, reducing control at high speeds. The result was a dangerously unbalanced vehicle, raw speed with no modern handling or braking to back it up. In the hands of an experienced race driver, it was thrilling, but in the hands of everyday drivers, many of them young, ambitious, and untrained, it became a recipe for disaster. Crashes were often severe. With no seatbelts, no crumple zones, and hard metal interiors, even low-speed collisions could be fatal. The steering column was rigid and unprotected, a deadly spear in a frontal impact. The car's popularity only amplified the danger. It was fast, affordable, and everywhere. The Rocket 88 became an icon, inspiring songs, headlines, and an entire generation of performance vehicles. But it also serves as a reminder, putting power into the hands of the public without safety is a gamble, and in the case of the Rocket 88, one that often ended in tragedy.
Number 9. In the 1950s, Buick represented prestige. Sitting just below Cadillac in the GM hierarchy, the Buick Super was marketed as a luxurious yet powerful sedan, a car for the successful family man or traveling businessman. With wide chrome grilles, sweeping fenders, and plush interiors, it looked like comfort on wheels. But beneath its polished exterior, the Buick Super hid a number of serious safety flaws. At its core, the danger started with weight and speed. The Buick Super was a very large and heavy vehicle, weighing over 4,000 pounds. It was powered by a strong straight-8 engine that could deliver impressive performance for its time. fast enough to keep up on highways and leave other cars behind on long stretches. But that speed came at a price. The braking system simply wasn't up to the task. Like most cars of the era, it used drum brakes, but the Super's sheer mass meant that those brakes often struggled to bring the car to a stop quickly. In real-world conditions, especially during emergency maneuvers, the stopping distance could be frighteningly long. When loaded with passengers and luggage, the performance of the brakes dropped even further. There was no redundancy, no anti-lock system, and no modern fail-safes. You pressed the pedal and hoped for the best. But it wasn't just the brakes that posed a problem. Inside the cabin, the Buick Super had what designers of the day considered stylish and modern. Shiny metal trim, hard plastic knobs, sharp switches, and polished surfaces. In a crash, these features became deadly hazards. There was no soft-touch interior, no padding, and certainly no airbags. Even a mild impact could send passengers flying into the dash or side pillars. The bench seats, while spacious, were often slippery, and without seatbelts, occupants could be ejected from their positions during sudden turns or stops. The steering column added another layer of risk. It was a rigid shaft pointed directly at the driver's chest, common for the time, but terrifying by today's standards. In a frontal collision, it could impale the driver, a well-documented cause of fatal injuries in crashes throughout the 1940s and 50s. What made the Buick Super especially deceptive was how safe it felt. It was quiet, it was smooth, it felt solid. But in a high-speed accident, that calm luxury turned into a trap. There were no crumple zones to absorb impact, the doors could burst open under side collisions, and the frame transferred most of the crash force directly to the passengers. In short, the Buick Super was built for comfort and image, not survival. It represents an era when aesthetics and prestige were more important than engineering safety, and when speed was celebrated without much thought to what happened when things went wrong.
Number 8.
In the pursuit of progress, the auto industry has often taken bold risks, and few vehicles better illustrate both the brilliance and the consequences of that ambition than the Nash Airflight. First introduced in the late 1940s and continuing production into the early 1950s, the Airflight was unlike anything else on the road. At a time when most cars still looked like rolling boxes with fenders, Nash offered something entirely different, a car shaped by the wind. Its rounded, sealed design, what the company proudly called envelope styling, was one of the earliest serious attempts at building a fully aerodynamic production sedan. It looked like the future. It felt like the future. And for a while, it sold like the future. But that futuristic design came with a hidden price. Safety was never part of the equation. The very thing that made the Airflight innovative, its fully integrated body, also made it dangerously difficult to escape in the event of an accident. With no traditional seams or body panel brakes, the car's structure often twisted or jammed shut during collisions. In rollovers or side impacts, the heavy doors could become impossible to open. Worse, there were no emergency exit options, no pop-out windows, no breakaway panels, and no reinforced points for rescuers to cut into. In essence, the car's sleek body acted like a sealed capsule, trapping occupants inside during some of their most vulnerable moments. Inside the cabin, the design was no more forgiving. The cabin was filled with rigid materials, a metal dashboard, sharp chrome trim, and unpadded surfaces, all potential hazards in a crash. Passengers sat on wide, slippery bench seats without any form of restraint. In the event of a collision, they were thrown forward or sideways, often striking the interior with full force. Compounding the issue, like most cars of its time, the Airflight had no crumple zones, no engineered areas to absorb and deflect crash energy away from the passengers. The force of impact traveled directly into the rigid passenger cell, putting all the stress on the bodies inside. A high-speed crash in the Nash Airflight often meant
catastrophic injuries, even if the exterior of the car appeared relatively intact. And yet, it was marketed as a safe and smart choice because it was aerodynamic, fuel efficient, and modern. The very things that made it appealing in a showroom were the same factors that made it so dangerous on the road. Today, the Nash Airflight stands as a symbol of a critical turning point in automotive history, a time when style and innovation sometimes overshadowed the basic need for occupant protection. It serves as a harsh reminder: progress, when pursued without foresight, can lead directly into danger.
Number 7. In the years following World War II, a wave of independent American car makers tried to challenge the dominance of Detroit's Big Three. Among them, the Kaiser-Frazer Corporation stood out with bold styling and innovative production. The Kaiser Deluxe was one of its flagship family cars, sleek, modern, and affordable. It promised comfort and forward-thinking engineering for the everyday American. But what it didn't offer was safety. At first glance, the Kaiser Deluxe looked competitive. It was lighter than its rivals, giving it slightly better fuel economy and a smoother ride. But that lightweight construction came at a high cost in crash performance. The car's doors and roof structure were notoriously fragile. In many collisions, especially rollovers or side impacts, they crumpled with alarming ease. The thin pillars and roof supports lacked the internal bracing found in heavier vehicles of the time, meaning the entire upper structure could collapse onto passengers in a serious accident. But the most serious flaw wasn't the frame, it was the door latching system. Kaiser's doors were known to fly open during crashes, especially in side impacts or sudden deceleration. The latches, made with cost-saving designs, were unable to hold under the strain of a collision. Without seatbelts, which, like in most cars of the era, were not standard, passengers were often thrown from the vehicle. Ejection from a moving car, even at moderate speeds, was usually fatal or severely injurious. Inside the vehicle, safety was equally absent. Like many cars of the early 1950s, the Kaiser Deluxe featured rigid metal dashboards, unpadded surfaces, and bench seats. There were no airbags, no headrests, and no structural reinforcements to protect against side impacts. The steering column remained a solid rod, often the first point of injury in a frontal crash. What made the Kaiser Deluxe especially deceptive was its image. It was marketed as modern, even futuristic in design. And in many ways it was, offering features like push-button door handles and sleek styling cues borrowed from aircraft. But beneath that modern show was a vehicle that simply wasn't built to protect its occupants in the worst moments. For families that chose the Kaiser Deluxe in search of innovation and affordability, the trade-off was hidden until tragedy struck. And when it did, the car's weaknesses were undeniable.
Number 6.
In the early 1950s, the Hudson Motor Car Company was still clinging to its place in the American auto industry. Known for its sleek, step-down design and racing success, Hudson built cars that looked low, fast, and futuristic. But when it came to safety, especially in its more affordable offerings, not all was as well engineered as it seemed. Enter the Hudson Pacemaker, the company's entry-level sedan. At a glance, it appeared to be a scaled-down version of the more luxurious Hudson models, with a similar low-slung body and spacious interior. But beneath that sleek exterior lay a troubling combination of design flaws that made it dangerous, especially in real-world driving conditions. The first and most immediate issue was poor visibility. The Pacemaker's low roofline and high beltline created narrow window openings, especially toward the front corners and rear sides. Drivers often struggled to see approaching traffic, pedestrians, or obstacles, especially at intersections or while backing up. This problem was magnified at night or in bad weather, where the car's small and dim headlights provided limited forward vision. In an era without backup cameras or blind spot detection, the design compromised basic situational awareness, a critical factor in preventing accidents. But visibility was only part of the problem. The Hudson Pacemaker also suffered from an overweight chassis. The car was heavy for its class, largely due to its unibody structure.
a cutting-edge idea at the time, but one that wasn't fully refined in terms of balancing strength with weight. This extra weight placed significant strain on the car's underdimensioned braking system, which was not powerful enough for emergency stops. The brakes often overheated, faded, or failed entirely during prolonged, repeated use, a terrifying prospect on hills or in traffic. Combine poor visibility with sluggish braking, and you have a recipe for disaster. Add to that a steering system that was vague and imprecise by modern standards, and the driver was often left reacting too late or not at all when hazards appeared. Inside the vehicle, like most cars of the early 1950s, there were no seatbelts, no padded surfaces, and a metal dash that could become deadly in a collision. The steering wheel, large and rigid, was another common cause of injury in frontal crashes. Despite these flaws, the Hudson Pacemaker sold reasonably well as a budget-conscious family sedan. It promised style at a lower cost, but it delivered that savings at the expense of basic driving safety. Looking back, the Pacemaker is a prime example of a car designed during a time when styling and innovation were prioritized far above driver protection. It wasn't alone in its shortcomings, but its mix of limited visibility, poor braking, and heavy bodywork made it especially problematic. For many drivers, the danger wasn't something they noticed right away until it was too late.
Number 5.
In the ever-evolving landscape of American automotive design, the early 1950s were a time of fierce competition. Smaller manufacturers like the Studebaker Corporation fought to survive by offering something different, something lighter, sleeker, and more economical. Enter the Studebaker Champion, a compact sedan marketed as practical, affordable, and forward-looking. It stood out from the crowd with its streamlined styling and modest price tag. But behind its modern looks and lightweight body was a dangerous truth. The Studebaker Champion was not built to handle the demands of real-world high-speed driving. As American highways grew longer and faster, cars like the Champion were pushed beyond the limits they were engineered for. With its narrow track width and soft suspension, the Champion had a tendency to become unstable in critical situations. At moderate speeds on a straight road, it handled decently, but during sudden maneuvers, emergency braking, lane changes, or sharp turns, the Champion revealed its flaws. The car's soft springs allowed for excessive body roll, and its narrow stance made it prone to skidding, fishtailing, or even rolling over. These issues weren't just theoretical. Drivers in the 1950s reported difficulty maintaining control during evasive actions, and the car's tendency to lose grip made it especially hazardous in wet or uneven conditions. The Champion was notoriously unforgiving during panic stops or fast directional changes, especially for inexperienced drivers. The problem was compounded by other limitations of the time. The Studebaker Champion used bias-ply tires, which had poor road adhesion compared to modern radial tires, and braking systems that were barely adequate for a car of its weight. Once control was lost, recovery was difficult, and crash survival wasn't much better. Inside the vehicle, the Champion was Spartan and functional, but like most of its era, it offered no meaningful crash protection. There were no seatbelts, no padded surfaces, and a solid metal dashboard. The steering column, rigid and mounted close to the driver's chest, was often a direct cause of fatal injuries in frontal impacts. And because it was a smaller, lighter car, it also fared poorly in multi-vehicle collisions, especially against the larger, heavier American sedans that dominated the roads. In any crash involving a speed differential, the Champion was often at the losing end. Despite these dangers, the Studebaker Champion was a popular car for a time. It represented a different approach to car ownership, efficient, nimble, and stylish. But in the push for affordability and innovation, fundamental driving safety was overlooked. The Studebaker Champion remains a sobering case study in how good intentions, building a small, fuel-efficient family car, can still lead to poor outcomes when engineering shortcuts and instability are baked into the design.
Number 4.
In the years immediately following World War II, the American auto industry roared back to life, and with it came a new generation of cars built for comfort, style, and family life. The Plymouth Special Deluxe, produced by Chrysler's Plymouth division, was one of the more popular post-war family cars. It offered reliability, an attractive price, and plenty of room for the average household. But under the surface of this trusted nameplate hid some very real dangers. The Plymouth Special Deluxe looked like progress, but when it came to safety, it was frozen in time. First and foremost, the car suffered from severely underpowered braking. Weighing over 3,200 pounds in some configurations, the Special Deluxe still relied on mechanically simple drum brakes that faded quickly under pressure. In emergency situations, it could take dangerously long distances to come to a stop. On wet roads or downhill slopes, those braking systems were often unreliable and uneven, leading to skids or loss of control. Another major concern was steering effort and response. The Special Deluxe used an early recirculating ball steering mechanism, which was both heavy and vague. At low speeds, turning the wheel required serious physical effort. But worse, at high speeds, the steering felt loose and unresponsive, making evasive maneuvers nearly impossible. This was especially dangerous for drivers reacting to unexpected obstacles. The car simply couldn't respond quickly enough. Inside the cabin, things didn't get much better. The interior of the Special Deluxe reflected the norms of the 1940s: metal dashboard, hard knobs, and absolutely no safety padding. In an era before seatbelts were even offered, a collision often meant that passengers would be violently thrown forward, directly into hard surfaces. Head and facial injuries were incredibly common, and the steering column itself, a rigid spear-like component, posed a serious risk to the driver during frontal impacts. The car also lacked side impact protection. The doors were thin and had no reinforcement beams, meaning that even a low-speed side collision could seriously injure those seated near the impact zone. Despite these flaws, the Plymouth Special Deluxe was a popular choice, especially among middle-class families and returning veterans. Its roomy interior and classic looks gave it broad appeal, but the safety compromises it carried were not fully understood at the time. Today, the Special Deluxe serves as a stark reminder of an era when passenger protection was an afterthought, not a design priority. It's a symbol of the post-war optimism that flooded American roads, but also of the very real risks that came with driving in a world before crumple zones, seatbelts, and modern crash engineering.
Number 3. In post-war America, the Chevrolet Styleline Deluxe stood as a symbol of progress. Stylish, reliable, and widely accessible, it was the kind of car you'd expect to see in every driveway across suburban neighborhoods. Introduced in 1949 and produced into the early 1950s, the Styleline Deluxe was a bestseller, a staple of the new American dream. But beneath its polished chrome and smooth contours lay a range of serious safety flaws that made it far more dangerous than it seemed. The most glaring issue? The doors. During a collision, particularly side impacts or rollovers, the doors of the Styleline Deluxe were known to fly open without warning. The latch mechanisms, designed before modern safety testing standards, were not strong enough to withstand crash forces. In an era with no seatbelts, an open door during an impact meant one thing: ejection. Passengers, especially children and those in the front seat, were frequently thrown from the vehicle, often resulting in serious or fatal injuries. But the door issue was just the beginning. Inside the cabin, the dashboard was made entirely of steel, cold, hard, and unforgiving. In frontal crashes, passengers were often hurled forward into this metal slab. There were no airbags, no soft surfaces, and no restraint systems to protect them. A simple fender bender could result in head trauma, broken facial bones, or worse, simply because the dashboard acted like a wall of iron. The side panels of the car were paper-thin by modern standards. There were no internal reinforcements, no beams, and no side impact protection zones. In a T-bone collision, the impact would go straight through the body panel and directly into the cabin. That meant that even a moderate crash could cause severe injuries to occupants seated near the doors, especially since the metal frame provided almost no energy absorption or deflection. Add to this the fact that the steering column was a fixed, rigid shaft pointed straight at the driver's chest, a deadly design flaw found in many cars of the time. In a high-speed crash, this column often collapsed inward, impaling or crushing the driver. Many fatalities in frontal collisions during this era were caused not by the crash itself, but by the car's own steering system. Despite these dangers, the Chevrolet Styleline Deluxe was beloved by many. It was reliable, affordable, and had the sleek, rounded design that defined 1950s automotive style. But what it offered in aesthetics and accessibility, it completely lacked in survivability. It reminds us of a time before crumple zones, before crash tests, before the word safety meant anything in the world of automotive design.
Number 2. Ford Custom Deluxe 1950s, a classic beauty with deadly flaws. In the booming post-war era, few names were as iconic on American roads as Ford. The Ford Custom Deluxe, introduced in the late 1940s and carried into the early 1950s, was one of the most popular full-size sedans of its time. It was roomy, affordable, and stylish, the kind of car that embodied family life in 1950s suburbia. But while it promised comfort and convenience, it came with some serious safety oversights that turned this classic into a potential death trap in a crash. One of the most dangerous design flaws of the Custom Deluxe was hidden in plain sight: the fuel tank. In this model, the gas tank was located directly behind the rear seat, just inches away from the passenger compartment. At the time, this design made sense for space and balance, but in the event of a rear-end collision, it posed a massive fire hazard. A strong enough impact could rupture the tank, causing fuel to spill and ignite. Without firewalls or modern containment systems, flames could easily spread into the cabin. Survivors of the initial impact often had mere seconds to escape, and many never did. But the fire risk wasn't the only issue. Like most vehicles of its day, the Ford Custom Deluxe was built without seatbelts. That meant any crash, even at relatively low speeds, would throw passengers forward with the full force of the impact. The front bench seat, while comfortable, did nothing to secure or restrain the human body. Drivers and passengers were often hurled into the hard metal dashboard, windshield, or each other during collisions. The driver in particular faced an additional threat: the steering column. In the Custom Deluxe, the steering shaft was a solid, non-collapsible rod aimed directly at the driver's chest. In a frontal crash, this rigid column had nowhere to go, and often impaled or crushed the driver as the force of the crash pushed the steering wheel straight into the torso. This tragic design flaw was responsible for countless fatal injuries, and eventually led to the development of collapsible steering systems in the 1960s and beyond. The car also lacked any form of crash engineering. There were no crumple zones, no side impact protection, no energy-absorbing materials. The Custom Deluxe was built like a tank, and in a crash, that rigidity worked against its occupants. Instead of absorbing energy, the car transmitted it directly to the people inside. Despite these serious dangers, the Ford Custom Deluxe was a bestseller in its day. It was reliable, had elegant curves, and came in both 2-door and 4-door models to suit growing families. But with its design locked into the priorities of its time, style, size, and cost over safety, it became part of a generation of cars that looked safe, but weren't.
Number 1. After World War II, Americans were eager to bring a piece of battlefield reliability into civilian life. That piece was the Willys Jeep, and in 1949, its rugged DNA was repackaged into the CJ3A, the civilian Jeep. It looked tough, it was tough, and it quickly became a favorite among farmers, outdoorsmen, and anyone looking for an off-road workhorse. But with all its utilitarian charm, the CJ3A came with a shocking lack of basic safety, making it one of the most dangerous vehicles you could drive on public roads in the early 1950s. Let's start with the most obvious issue: no doors, no roof, no seatbelts. The Willys CJ3A wasn't designed for safety. It was designed for functionality and simplicity, a bare-bones vehicle built for back roads and rugged terrain. But when civilians took it onto highways and city streets, that minimalism became a liability. There was nothing keeping passengers inside the vehicle. In the event of a sharp turn, sudden swerve, or collision, people were frequently ejected from the Jeep, often landing hard on pavement or being struck by the vehicle itself as it rolled or tipped. And it did, frequently. One of the most dangerous characteristics of the CJ3A was its high center of gravity combined with a short wheelbase. This made it extremely prone to tipping, especially during sudden maneuvers on paved roads. Even at modest speeds, an unexpected obstacle, quick lane change, or overcorrection could result in the Jeep rolling onto its side, or worse, flipping completely. And without a roll bar, roof, or reinforced frame overhead, the consequences for occupants were often fatal. The lack of side protection made things even worse. With no doors, even a minor side impact could cause serious injuries or send the driver or passenger flying out of the cabin. There were no crumple zones, no side impact beams, no energy absorption, just open space and a steel shell. Inside the Jeep, the story didn't get any better. The interior was utilitarian to a fault, a hard steel dashboard, exposed metal everywhere, and no restraints of any kind. In a collision, occupants were thrown forward into solid surfaces with full force, often suffering head, chest, or spinal injuries. There was nothing to cushion a blow or keep passengers secured in their seats. To be fair, the CJ3A was never marketed as a highway cruiser. It was built for farms, trails, and utility. But as more people used it like a car, commuting, traveling, even transporting families, its design flaws became life-threatening.